Do you know the feeling where you're banging your head against a wall like, why can't I get my kids to obey me? I definitely do. Welcome to Worldly Families. I'm Justine Janae, and I love exploring the intersection of scientific research, other cultural perspectives, our own intuition, and my experiences as a mama of two in order to help you become and raise conscious global citizens without wasting hours of time researching or years of trial and error racking up the gray hairs one tantrum at a time. If you'd like more videos like this one, please subscribe and click the bell to be notified every time I release a new video. Before you begin to change the way you parent, it's really important to understand the context of how and why you parent the way you do. In one of my favorite parenting books, The Soul of Discipline, Kim John Payne, MED, breaks down parenting fads throughout the last 3 generations and gives us some tips I'm going to share about how to avoid the current fad, which is the good job for everything. Pre-1940s, blind obedience. For people who became parents during the Great Depression or World War II, everything was about hardship. The kids contributed because everyone was in survival mode and they knew that they needed to contribute to the family. So discipline wasn't even really an issue. Kids just pitched in. In fact, over 100 years ago, kids were given homework that was literally homework. Things like baking pies, sweeping the floor, doing the dishes. And so they learned to help out at home. That was part of their role. 1940 to 1960, the transitional years. In the wake of World War II, the economy began to recover and society was prosperous. Now, parents were starting to shake off the shackles of the old ways, viewing it as too strict, like parents were too uptight, and that kids were even being suppressed. And thus, the pendulum was set in motion, swinging all the way to the other side, where parenting was loose and freewheeling and relaxed. 1970s, the freedom years. By the 1970s, the pendulum had fully swung to the other side. Parents were allowing new freedoms, mandatory chores at home were disappearing, and parents were talking about how they wanted their kids to be able to be experimental and creative, as opposed to following strict disciplinary rules. In fact, when kids said no to their parents, it was no longer seen as intolerable defiance. Instead, it was seen as healthy, creative self-expression, and kids were even allowed and encouraged to negotiate and even debate with their parents. The downside to all this freedom is that kids didn't know where to draw the line, and they began to have trouble in school or with authority figures. The 1980s, the Gold Star years. In the 1980s, psychologist B.F. Skinner's behavior modification, or BMOD, became all the rage. It was essentially the giving and taking away of privileges in order to train your children, kind of like Pavlovian dogs, to behave in the ways that you wanted them to. The problem with this is that it only worked for about 3 to 6 months. Kids are very smart, you might have noticed, and they very quickly figure out ways to beat any system. So their obedience came not from a place of actually respecting the authority of their parent, but from a place of, what can I get out of this? A la, I'll do that for 3 cookies, but not for 2 cookies. Ultimately, this undermines the relationship with the parents and or teachers. And in fact, unfortunately, behavior modification has leaked into our schools and stained it permanently. We have a lot of work to do to get out of that system of charts and gold stars in our schools. 1990s, parents become the management. By the time the 90s rolled around, parents were sick of being prison wardens, and they knew that their kids were just trying to beat the system anyway. Clearly, it wasn't working. Also at this time, parents were staying in the workforce longer and having kids later. So they decided to take some of these workforce principles and apply them at home. Instead of telling their kids what to do, they would have family meetings where they were the manager and the kids were the team. Parents would allow kids tons of choices, and if the kid made the wrong choice, instead of guiding them toward a better choice, they would allow the natural consequences to follow. Sometimes these were even scary or dangerous consequences. Then they would review the consequences with the child Was that a great choice? Was that an okay choice? Or was that a poor choice? Again, kids are wired to game the system, so they very quickly realized what they needed to say to get out of the post-mortem with their parents. Until the age of 9, kids haven't even really developed the ability to understand social cause and effect. And because of that, when they make the wrong decision, they feel unsafe and insecure and like nobody's actually really in charge. By giving kids just a ton of options and no true guidance, they aren't sure who's in charge. The belief was that natural consequences would allow the child to really understand what happens as a result of their choices and actions. However, the issue with this style of parenting is that the kids' prefrontal lobes are not developed enough to have big picture thinking and zoom out and do what's better for the long term or for the larger group. They really still are in this mode of doing what's best for them and whatever they can get immediately. It turns out that kids are not adults in a workforce, and they actually do need guidance toward the right choices. Another issue with parents playing the managers is that we can't quit. And we can't fire our kids. So if our kids unionize and they all say, we're not doing it, we have no backup source of power or authority. Our power and authority needs to come from our relationship with our kids. The 2000s to today, good job, behavior affirmation. As a response to this parenting in the 90s, the pendulum has swung in the other direction and has remained there ever since. You might be surprised to think that we are actually in a strict parenting mode right now, but Payne says it perfectly, so I'm actually going to read this to you. Behavior affirmation is subtle and seems on the surface to be liberal, positive, and encouraging of a child or teen. However, while it is normal and natural to affirm children and let them know how much you appreciate their help, behavior affirmation takes praise to a whole other level, almost maniacal in its intensity and frequency. In fact, it's like a sugar-coated version of behavior modification, only emphasis is placed on praise rather than punishment. Bam, that says it all. Basically, we are manipulating our children's need for appreciation and approval in order to get them to behave the way we want them to behave. I have to admit, I am horrible with this. Even after years of knowing this and trying my best to not good job everything, I still catch myself constantly. It's like a reflex. But here's the problem. When you over-affirm, several negative consequences can follow. One is that kids can get over-cynical. They understand that you're not really being real with them. They drew a squiggly line and you're like, oh, great job, it's so beautiful. And they're like, no, it's not. That breaks down trust between you and your kid. Sometimes they'll even start to defy you because they're trying to push for when you're being real and authentic and when you're not. Second, kids can become self-centered, both in their family relationships and with their friends. They can start to look at relationships as, what can I get out of this? As opposed to, how can I help the other person flourish? They can have a hard time developing empathy. Third, kids can actually have a harder time learning because they're more concerned with looking smart and getting the good grades than actually being smart and learning and challenging themselves. When we overpraise kids, we train them to work for that external reward of the praise as opposed to the internal reward of the actual learning that they're getting. This can cause kids to develop an overt fear of failure. Even though I'm an 80s baby, I was also raised with a lot of praise. And for that reason and many other reasons, I was an extremely high achiever always trying to get the top grades, graduate with honors. And so when I was in my MBA program and I had a baby at the time and I was president of a startup at the time, my sister said, Justine, if you graduate with honors, I'm gonna be so pissed at you. Because she knew it would mean that I was deprioritizing my relationships, my work, my family, and that I was prioritizing academic achievement, again, to get these accolades. So a few months into the program, it was actually my goal not to graduate with honors. And a few months into the program, I ended up getting a few kind of average grades, not high grades. And I realized that I probably wouldn't graduate with honors. In the back of my mind, I was like, unless I get all superior passes for the rest of the program. No, Justine, no. So I was driving, it was a 5-minute drive to my grandparents' house. And I remember I was crying. I was having this existential crisis, like, who am I if I'm not graduating with honors? It was so tied to my identity of who I was, that I was somebody that got straight A's, that I didn't know what to do after that. I lost all motivation. And for the next few months, I just didn't even really try. I was having such a hard time even understanding why or how to care. And then it was through working with my team and realizing that I contributed to my team in a meaningful way that I needed to step up my game. And I found a kind of a rhythm again and focused more on the learning that I could get out of the program and less on the accolades or the GPA. But this was a big journey for me and a big breakthrough after all of this training. And we can save our kids needing to go through that at whatever age, late 20s, early 30s, maybe 40s or 50s, by starting right now with helping them to have the internal intrinsic motivation to do well and to learn and to put in effort regardless of the external accolades. Fourth, we can create a watch me dependency. If you've ever been to a pool with your kids, you might know exactly what I'm talking about. Watch me as they do a handstand. Watch me as they go underwater. Watch me as they jump off the side of the pool. Everything needs to be watched when they're so used to getting praised for everything. Recently, I've told my daughter Autumn, I'm going to watch you 5 times this entire time that we're at the pool. So you practice all on your own. And when you want to perform something for me, then you tell me. And that has really helped her to focus on making something really good. And she gets into this creative mode and she practices and practices. And then finally she uses one of her watch me's and has me watch it. Maybe eventually we'll get away from that altogether, but this is a nice little baby step. So what can you do instead of the good job, good job, good job? One thing you can do is called parallel parking. It's simply sitting next to your kid and engaging in some activity while they engage in another activity. Not even saying a word, just being there present with each other while you're just both calmly enraptured in your own world. Payne writes that a quiet, loving presence is deeply affirming to a child. So, we don't always need to speak. Try to pause, and before you say good job, just be there noticing what your child is doing. They'll notice that you're noticing even if you don't say anything. You might try a semi-verbal affirmation. This is value neutral. It's something like, or well, or gosh. These type of comments aren't distracting to the child and they allow them to still remain absorbed in their own world of what they're doing and creating. Another alternative to good job is to praise the process itself. This is key to teaching your kids that it's actually about the process and not about the outcome. Autumn loves to draw, and sometimes she'll get down on herself if the drawing doesn't turn out the way that she wanted it to, and she'll say that it's bad. I always reaffirm to her that this is not about whether the drawing is good or bad. It's about the process of enjoying, creating, and practicing and getting better and better each time. Try saying things to your kid like, oh, that's really coming along well. Or you've really moved that along. You can also be practical and specific. For example, wow, I noticed that you set the table without even being asked. Thank you. You can also praise the timing. For example, Autumn, that was a really good time to help your baby brother. He seemed really upset and you noticed that and came and entertained him. You can affirm the difficulty or the mistake. This encourages grit. When you say something to your kid like, wow, Autumn, I noticed that you were really struggling with that, but you kept up at it. See, I almost said good job again. Another alternative to good job is to say what you see. If your kid draws something for you, instead of saying, oh, good job, or this is great, you can look at it and say, you used a lot of red. And often just stopping there, the kid will open up about their creative process. Something else you can do is ask a related question. Oh, what made you decide to use triangles here? How did you figure out how to draw the bow like that? And finally, you can recall and review previous successes. Kids really live in the present. So if they're feeling down about something that they just drew, for example, and it didn't turn out the way that they wanted to, you can affirm the way that they're feeling by saying, I understand that you're feeling really frustrated right now. I could see why you'd be frustrated that this didn't turn out the way that you wanted it to. And I remember that you've done this several times in the past. You've really stuck to it and you've practiced and you've been able to draw what you wanted to. This reminds the kids of past successes, and it helps them understand that the actual effort and process is a really important part of it. This is much better than just inundating your kids with a bunch of suggestions or trying to fix it yourself or show them how to do it better, which might actually make them feel inadequate. You need to let them figure it out. So, in conclusion, in order to avoid all of these parenting trends and fads, it's first important to be aware of them. So now you are, and when you notice yourself being overly affirmative, just pause, take a breath, and then either don't say anything or try to remember one of the tips that I gave you as an alternative and practice that. Essentially, tap into the core of how you feel. If your kid did something that's not that great, don't say good job. Be authentic to what you truly feel. If you can appreciate something about it, like, wow, there's a lot of red there, or wow, that is a lot of squiggles, then say that instead. Your kids will notice that you're being real and authentic with them, and that will teach them by example how to be real and authentic with their friends and their future relationships growing up.